Hi everyone, sorry about the short technical difficulty there, but thank you all for joining us for the Year in Preview webinar. Apologies. Please let me know on the screen if there are any questions that you have or any issues concerning the microphone or sound. But other than that, if you could kindly mute your audio on your end so that the background noise and sound doesn't come through for other participants, that will be greatly appreciated. So thank you for joining us. My name is Wes O'Donnell. I'm National Workplace Relations Manager with HR Assured, which is part of the FCB Group incorporating Enable HR. I think we can all agree that there's been rapid change in the landscape of industrial relations and HR throughout the course of this year, and we're only part way through. The pace of that change and the implications for the economy and businesses in general is just unprecedented. So whilst we previously anticipated to provide a more general overview of 2020 and anticipated events which we think are relevant for business, as you would expect, the nature of this presentation has fundamentally changed to address many of our clients' concerns and questions arising in relation to COVID-19 and all related events. So in that respect, we will focus predominantly upon the COVID-19 outbreak, the pandemic which has arisen, and the implications upon you and your business, together with your employees, and how to keep them safe. We will, however, discuss a number of additional matters towards the end of the presentation concerning matters such as the 2014 award review, also issues concerning the annualisation provisions which have been incorporated into the modern award, as well as the increasing focus upon compliance in relation to the payment of wages. So that being said, we will go through this webinar. It was intended to last an hour in duration. There will be an opportunity to ask questions towards the end of the webinar. You will see on your screen there is a Q&A function. Please feel free to ask questions at any time through the course of the webinar, and where possible, I will try to address some of the questions on the topic as discussed as those questions come through. If, however, for whatever reason, I'm unable to see or action those questions as they come through, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions towards the end before we wrap up. So, as I said from the outset, COVID-19 has fundamentally overtaken all of our business priorities, objectives and time in the early stages of 2020. We are seeing a rapid growth in inquiries and contact for assistance from clients and members of HR Assured and Enable HR who are struggling to keep abreast of the changes and the pace of those change and its implications for employees and their business. With that, we've designed this presentation to address the majority of the questions that we're seeing from clients and members so that we can provide a little bit more certainty around your approach and provide some more commercial options and practical options for you and your business to consider. Some of the more common types questions which we're seeing have, as you would expect, evolved over the course of the pandemic. Initially, we were seeing general questions concerning employee sickness arising from international travel, or whether they have been directly involved with or accessed persons which have been diagnosed. As that's developed over time, however, questions have more been relating to an actual or likely stoppage of work due to either a general downturn in consumer demand or more macroeconomic factors concerning government regulations, concerning the operation of particular businesses in particular industries. And we expect that to continue. Unfortunately, as this pandemic continues and government regulations increase, we expect that those type of inquiries may lead into general questions concerning redundancies and insolvency. So with that, we will try to address a majority of questions which are arising. The first and probably the most basic type question which is frequently asked is, under what circumstances can my employees be absent from the workplace? What if my employee is sick or not sick but otherwise exposed to COVID-19 and required to self-isolate? What are their rights and what are my obligations as an employer? The first thing to remember is that all permanent employees have a right to take personal carers leave. And I think it's important that we stop there and use that phrase correctly. Many employers incorrectly use the phrase sick leave, but the proper definition is personal carers leave, meaning that a permanent employee has the right to remain absent from work where they are unfit for work due to personal illness or injury. And that's the personal element of the definition. A worker also has the ability to remain absent from work due to a member of their immediate household or family also being unwell due to illness or injury. Classic scenario with this is that an employee needs to remain absent to care for a child or dependent adult member of their household who are unwell due to illness or injury. The personal carers leave definition also extends to an unexplained absence, and we'll get to that in a moment. However, it's probably the easiest aspect to consider in that in the event that your employee is actually unwell and unfit to work due to personal injury or illness or that of a family member or member of their household, they are entitled to personal carers leave and paid personal carers leave if they're a permanent employee and have an accumulated entitlement. So in that sense, an employee can access their accumulated entitlements for either their own sickness or that of a family member or their household. Once their accumulated paid entitlement is exhausted, then any ongoing period of absence is unpaid. A common question which we're seeing is whether an employee can be excluded from the workplace by exhibiting flu-like symptoms but are otherwise well to attend work. This is a really complex area in the context of the pandemic, and we say that there is a compelling argument to exclude that employee from the workplace and to utilise personal carers leave in the circumstances. Another question is often arising in the context of COVID-19 in the sense of the duration or expected duration of someone's absence from the workplace. We know that people that are diagnosed with COVID-19 are technically a carrier for an extended period of time, and as such we expect that those individuals will remain absent from the workplace over time. In that respect, once they've exhausted their personal carers leave allocation, any continued period of leave is unpaid. With the consent of the employer, an employee may, however, elect to utilise any period of paid leave, such as annual leave and long service leave. However, the employer is unable to direct an employee to do so. In that respect, they have a right to continued absence, which will be unpaid, and unfortunately there is no absolute right on an employer to direct an employee to utilise their period of paid leave to annual leave and long service leave. In terms of the questions around shutdown, we'll address those in a moment, so I won't specifically deal with that question at this point in time. There is a question, obviously, around self-isolation, and the rules have been developing over time. However, currently, there is an obligation on an employee to self-isolate where they have returned from overseas after the 15th of March 2020. They are a confirmed case of coronavirus, or have been in close contact with someone who has been diagnosed with coronavirus. Recently, we have seen various states, Queensland, Western Australia and others, close their state borders to interstate travellers and also require those travelling from interstate to self-isolate upon arrival in certain circumstances. We have to say that under the particular state health orders and directives, that employees are required to observe these directions. In these circumstances, however, where an employee is otherwise well, but is required to self-isolate, they are not unfit for work due to illness and injury, and therefore the period of absence is not properly considered paid personal carers leave. Just to be clear on that, an employee who is otherwise fit for work but directed to remain at home and self-isolate for whatever reason is not eligible, in our view, to utilise paid personal carers leave entitlement. There has been a push from various union bodies, ACTU, etc., for the creation of additional paid leave in these circumstances so that employees will not be disadvantaged by having to be self-isolated. And we have seen a number of large employers say that effectively they will grant additional paid leave to effectively encourage employees to self-nominate and remain absent in the hope of reducing the spread of the pandemic in their workplace. However, the vast majority of employers are not acknowledging that additional request and treating any period of self-isolation as unpaid leave. If, however, an employee indicates that they are unfit and is able to provide a medical certificate or other satisfactory evidence in support of that, then the period would be a paid absence. If the absence is unpaid, there is no requirement upon an employer to do so. However, we strongly suggest that it would be best practice to allow an employee to utilise their paid entitlements, such as annual leave, long service leave, etc., so that there is no detriment to the employee. This is a considerable issue for many employers to address. Particularly in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, given that it was school holidays, the January period where many people were travelling back from ski holidays in America, Japan and Europe, and there were many trips booked. We find, however, that it's becoming less of a problem now that international travel is banned and also that many employees are cancelling their personal travel arrangements. We do suggest, however, that many businesses may wish to implement a COVID-19 policy, a general policy, but also touching upon the annual leave application process, where you may wish to request that an employee disclose whether the application for annual leave is in relation to overseas travel, where that overseas travel relates to, and indicate that the employee accepts that they will fully comply with any direction of the Department of Health to self-isolate upon their return, which will be considered a period of unpaid leave. We say these are factors, which an employer should be reasonably considering when considering an application, given that the 14-day period of self-isolation is certainly extending, in practical terms, the period of leave. In terms of other requirements to self-isolate, there is, as mentioned, a clear expectation that anyone that has been in close contact with someone with coronavirus must also self-isolate for 14 days. Again, it goes back to the previous comment that I made that period of self-isolation would be treated as unpaid, except where the employee is considered unfit for work due to illness or injury. Okay. Again, we've touched on this briefly, but there is obviously a concern from an employment perspective to minimise the risk of cross-contamination within a workplace, which will, if a pandemic spreads throughout the workplace, create significant problems for productivity and engagement across the business. Where an employee appears unfit for work or unwell or exhibiting flu-like symptoms, it is possible for an employer to direct an employee to return home, to work from home if possible, but to also seek medical opinion and provide a medical certificate certifying that they are fit for work. In the circumstances, given that a direction has been provided by the employer, that period will be treated as paid leave until such time as a medical certificate is provided indicating that the employee is unfit for work. Of course, through this discussion, I've mentioned on many occasions, we've been talking about a permanent employee's ability to take paid personal carers leave. Of course, casual employees are also entitled to personal carers leave where they are unfit for work, except it is a period of unpaid leave. The last element of the personal carers leave definition is in relation to unexpected emergencies. Now, typically this is where there is a fire, flood or other forms of natural disaster. However, we expect that many employees may seek to rely upon this provision in the event that there's a closure of their children's school or daycare facility. It's unclear, however, whether an employee will be able to consider the closure of a school or daycare facility of itself as an unexpected emergency which would enable them to take paid leave. It has to be said that through the development of this pandemic, the potential closure of schools and daycare facilities has been well publicised. There is frequent communication from an individual school or area district concerning the possibility or actual closure of facility. So there is at least some element of doubt or question whether the closure of a school or daycare facility would be sufficient to classify as an emergency to warrant the provision of paid leave. Naturally, every case would need to be considered on its merits, but we would suggest that in the circumstances, it may be that only a very minimal period of the initial absence may be considered leave. However, any extended period of closure would not of itself constitute an unexpected emergency which requires the payment of personal carers leave. So against that background, there's a constant question which we're seeing as to whether an employer can direct an employee to take annual leave. Yeah? Unfortunately, it's not necessarily an easy question to answer, given that the ability of an employer to direct an employee to take annual leave is governed by the terms of the modern award or enterprise agreement upon which they are employed or covered by. Many modern awards will limit the ability of an employer to direct an employee to take annual leave to circumstances where the employee has an excessive annual leave balance. Typically, in those circumstances, there is an extended notice period, typically around the 8-week mark, and will require an employee to retain a minimum balance of at least 6 weeks once the direction has been given. Yeah? In that sense, due to the notice requirement, often the direction for an employee to take leave is not a valid option and doesn't necessarily provide an employer with many options or solutions in the circumstance. Where an employee, however, is not covered by an enterprise agreement or modern award, the Fair Work Act indicates that an employee may be directed to take annual leave where that requirement is reasonable. Now, What is reasonable obviously turns on the circumstances and will depend on a lot of factors. However, given the nature of the pandemic and the wider macroeconomic circumstances, we think that there would be a very good argument to suggest that the current framework in which we trade in would enable or create a reasonable basis upon which an employee can be directed to take annual leave. An attendee has asked a question whether an employee can cash out annual leave to be able to gain government benefits. Two aspects to that. The first aspect is whether an employee can cash out annual leave, and the first element of that is the same as the direction to take annual leave. It ultimately depends upon whether an employee is firstly covered by a modern award or enterprise agreement, and that will dictate the terms upon which they can cash out. But again, typically it requires a minimum balance to be maintained. The question around government benefits, however, is an interesting one. However, there has been some confusion with Centrelink and the federal government around an employee's ability to seek social security payments in the current circumstances where there is an annual leave balance remaining. Our understanding is that the government has changed the rules to enable employees who remain employed, albeit stood down, to access Newstart, and there is not a requirement that they utilise or draw down their annual leave before their eligibility takes place. We'll discuss that in a moment though, but Eric, a very good question in the circumstances. So what if a workplace needs to close as a result of COVID-19? When the pandemic was first announced, this question was often arising in the context of an outbreak or cross-contamination within the workplace or a particular employee who is infected, and therefore there is a requirement to close the workplace due to that particular aspect. Since, however, this pandemic has deepened, that question has a number of facets to it. Unfortunately, it has been a reality in recent weeks, particularly this week, after the press release and announcement of the Prime Minister on Sunday evening, that many workplaces have been forced to close, either as a result of government direction and policy, or as a result of general downturn arising from that. And we'll deal with each circumstance in turn. Where a business closes as a result of an outbreak or an employee who is infected, and the business elects to close the premises and the workplace in order to minimise the risk of cross-contamination across employees, in that circumstance, the closure of the workplace is at the direction of the employer, and therefore there is an obligation to pay during that period. Having said that, however, it's obviously within the employer's right to direct an employee to work from home or have any other alternative circumstances put in place to ensure that a worker can remain proactive and productive and undertaking some form of work during that period. However, if an employee can't work from home or other suitable arrangements can't be put in place, then technically that period of absence or closure would be at pay. If, however, the result of the closure arises from some other factor, such as government-mandated closure, the business can utilise the stand-down provisions under the Fair Work Act, which will enable the employer to stand down their employee without pay during that period. Much has been said in the media this week concerning that, and we've seen very large businesses, Qantas, recently this week, Virgin Airlines, and others, which have announced widespread initiatives to stand down a large cohort of employees as a result. Under the Fair Work Act, it says that where an employer cannot usefully engage an employee for a variety of factors, including where there's a stoppage of work due to circumstances for which the employer cannot reasonably be held to account, the employer can stand an employee down without pay. We're seeing this very frequently this week, unfortunately, as a result of those businesses which can no longer operate and trade as a result of the government's mandated closure. Some of those businesses we can no longer trade businesses such as public swimming pools, indoor leisure facilities, registered and licensed clubs, restaurants and cafes, excluding their takeaway function, casinos, and of course pubs and gyms. In those circumstances, the government direction and mandate which prevents them from trading enables those businesses to enliven the stand-down provisions, in which case employees can be stood down without pay. Now, the important consideration in this context is that the employee is not terminated. Their employment obligation and relationship rather continues. The only difference in this circumstance is that the employer is not required to provide the employee with work, nor is the employer required to pay an employee during that period. The important thing to note, however, with that, is that during that period of stand down, an employee continues to accumulate entitlements as they ordinarily would. So that they would continue to accumulate long service leave, annual leave and sick leave in the normal course. The other thing to also consider is that under the legislation it states that an employee cannot be considered to be stood down during any period of paid leave. So to follow that through, we say that there's a number of implications to be considered in relation to this. The first is that where an employee is currently on a period of authorised annual leave, that period of annual leave will continue until its natural end. After that period of annual leave ceases, then the period of unpaid stand down will commence. The other thing to consider is that an employee who raises an annual leave request during the period of stand down has no right to take leave. The leave is only taken with the approval of the employer. Now, we say it's best practice, of course, to support your employees to the extent that you can in enabling them to take a period of paid leave during a stand down. And that may be paid leave of annual leave, it may be a period of paid leave concerning someone's accumulated long service leave entitlement. However, to be realistic, we understand and appreciate that the ability of many employers to do so will be a significant impost upon cash flow, where they're having to pay employees accumulated entitlements, annual leave, long service leave, without any revenue source coming in during that period. So whilst we say it's best practice, whilst we would certainly encourage it, from a realistic perspective, we understand that often that option is not available to many employers given cash flow considerations. The other thing to consider with a stand down as well is that due to that rule around authorised leave, any period of public holidays is not considered a stand down but rather paid. This is an important consideration in the context of the Easter period coming up, so that any period of absence will effectively need to be paid for those 2 days, Good Friday and Easter Monday. The question also arises in the context of, can an employee utilise their personal carers leave during this period? Yeah? Unfortunately not. The rules and the legislation states that an employee cannot be considered to be stood down where there is a period of authorised leave authorised by the employer. That, in our view, it does not incorporate personal carers leave, which isn't authorised by the employer, meaning that where an employee produces a medical certificate or any other form of evidence during the stand-down period, we say that has no effect and their period of unpaid stand-down continues. Some employers, however, have been in contact and indicated that they would nonetheless like to pay employees personal carers leave during this period, and can they do so should they wish. Look, technically I don't have an issue with that. The problem that I see is that it's not technically correct in terms of how that period should be defined. The risk with that, therefore, becomes that an employee will dispute that period of paid leave and ask that the period be reinstated to their personal carers leave balance. So it potentially may lead to a dispute around the proper classification of that absence and whether that period should be reinstated to their leave balance. So I think if an employer is willing to do that, and typically this arises in the context of where an employee has exhausted their annual leave entitlement, I personally think that probably the better approach would be for the employer to authorise annual leave in advance, meaning that the period is paid, and we're seeing some businesses like Qantas allowing their employees to go 4 weeks into the negative. What that will mean is the employees will receive pay, it will be annual leave in advance, and then in those circumstances we can have employees acknowledge through a standard form that this period is authorised in advance, but they also authorise and agree that that period of time will be repaid out of their accumulated entitlements when their employment is terminated for whatever reason, if it is terminated for whatever reason before they accumulate that period back. So I think that personally is a better option. It means that employers still continue to support their employees, and I also think that it minimises any commercial risk to the business moving forward. So it's probably something which you may wish to consider. A question's also come through in terms of whether they can take accumulated annual leave and long service leave as an alternative to the unpaid stand down. Well, hopefully my commentary answered that in the sense that yes, it can be proposed, yes, it can be suggested, but unfortunately it can't be directed. But obviously in those circumstances I would imagine that most employees would be more than willing to accept it in those circumstances. Yep. I've mentioned before around the non-work related travel. I kind of think that this is becoming less of an issue as the pandemic develops, in that obviously because our own government and other nations have prevented or banned foreign nationals from entering the country, it's becoming less of an issue in that most people have cancelled international travel plans for this year. But certainly I think it's a sensible suggestion that whenever there is an annual leave request, we should be considering requesting employees disclose whether there is any period of international travel. And of course, given the developments with Queensland and Western Australia recently, there may be sense in suggesting or requesting rather whether there is any proposed interstate travel, given that there is a period of required self-isolation which must occur. But just something to consider, and obviously the impact that has on the business is quite significant in the event that an employee is required to self-isolate for 14 days upon the return, which effectively increases their period of absence for a further 2 weeks in the event that the employee can't be usefully engaged at home during that period. Obviously, if an employee can be usefully engaged at home or work from home, that's fantastic. There's limited impact upon the business, but we just need to be conscious that there needs to be an open and transparent discussion with employees so that they're aware that if they're required to observe any period of self-isolation, that it's a period of unpaid leave. The question has arisen frequently from the pandemic around whether there is an obligation upon a company to consider alternative working arrangements. Whilst there's not an obligation, obviously we're strongly encouraging that all businesses explore this as best they can to ensure that they can continue trading and operating for an extended period of time. we would strongly suggest that there needs to be open and transparent conversations with employees and a degree of latitude concerning what is or would be considered reasonable in the circumstances as compared to previous times last year before the COVID-19 pandemic arose. And what I mean by that is where we previously would not have entertained someone working from home while they had care responsibilities for a child, it's frequently becoming common in these times that webinars and client meetings are conducted remotely with children noise in the background, and I actually think it's a fantastic thing to see that those experiences are being developed. A couple of questions have really arisen in the context of close down, so I'll address some of those in further detail before we go on, just because I anticipate that there is quite a few questions in relation to that. The first question is, Mosaic Retail recently stood down approximately 7,000 employees. However, there hasn't been a mandated closure of retail stores. How were they able to stand down their employees? I can't speak to Mosaic Retail experience directly, nor would I wish to speak to any particular company's experience directly. I do know that there have been various press articles where the basis upon which various retailers have formed the view that they are able to enact a stand down is that they are unable to effectively trade given the social distancing requirements. And that is, given the nature of the particular trade or business, they're unable to maintain the mandated 1.5 metre distance between their customer, or the nature of the store is such that they cannot maintain the minimum 4 square metre rule per individual. So that has been a basis upon which I know several businesses use that. Common thing to take away from this is that the ability for a particular business to stand employees down does not of itself require a direct government mandate. There may be other factors, such as compelling health requirements or a compelling health reason why businesses can potentially enact or enliven the stand-down provisions. What is really important is that businesses seek timely advice concerning their own particular circumstances to understand the extent to which it's relevant for them. The next question is about retail stores in a shopping centre, and it states that at this stage they're not included in the restrictions, but would employers need to pay on a stand down? If I understand the question correctly, if the retail shopping centre continues to operate, however, and a business has elected to not trade, much like my previous answer in relation to a particular retailer, there needs to be something more than just a downturn in consumer demand which leads to the stand down. Of itself, a decision to close an unprofitable business or a business or an establishment due to a reduction in consumer demand is not sufficient to meet the test of a stand down. The test of a stand down needs to be a stoppage of work due to circumstances beyond your control. Now, I appreciate that the pandemic and the current economic environment is beyond your control. Fully appreciate and I fully sympathise for all businesses that are trading through this environment. What I would suggest, though, is that in those particular circumstances where there's not a clear mandate preventing operations and stoppage of work, then timely advice be taken in your particular circumstances to ensure that you're not imposing a stand down in incorrect circumstances. The other questions coming through is a little bit in relation to annual leave requests. Quick question around whether an employee wishes to withdraw an annual leave request. Technically, you can accept that request should you wish, but there's no obligation upon you to do so. Next is a question concerning entitlements around redundancies, but we'll just get to that in a little bit in a moment. The next question is just in confirming that there is no obligation to pay. That is correct. Under a stand down, the stand down is without pay. Yeah? So that means you enact the stand down. We have a discussion with employees outlining the business reasons why there's a stoppage of work. We inform the employee that effectively they cannot be usefully engaged during this period. And effectively, we then say that they are unable to work. There is a period of unpaid leave. Their period of employment continues, albeit you'll continue to monitor the process on an ongoing basis to keep that stand-down period as short as possible. So in those circumstances, we think that there is obviously a good requirement, and there's template letters and forms which we can certainly provide during those circumstances. So moving on, alternative working arrangements, we would suggest that you become creative. We would suggest, to the extent that you can, you allow a degree of flexibility. We also suggest that you document that as best you can in writing to ensure that there is clear agreement what an employee is required to do and when. Yeah? Now, of itself, managing an employee at home shouldn't be challenging, but for some reason it is to some, because we're not used to it, we can't physically see an employee, and as managers and owners of businesses and proprietors of businesses, we're going to have to get better at this ourselves. But that's part of the challenge. So I'd suggest, first of all, where there is a consideration to work from home, if you haven't done so already, and this is generally in circumstances where working from home is new, get a WHS self-assessment or a disclosure form completed. We've got obviously copies of these forms on HRA Cloud or Enable HR, and I'd strongly suggest you do this, which means that effectively you're getting your employee to undertake a WHS self-assessment of their own workplace, their home, to ensure that there's no work health safety hazards, trips hazards, that they have proper ergonomic facilities, etc. And you're considering all of those WHS issues before you authorise any period of work from home. The other suggestion is that we do frequent catch-ups, that there be some form of formal review and contact with employees to check on their well-being and their welfare, and that you have clear understandings around what work is required to be produced in the time it's required. So whilst there's a few challenges around managing the work from home process, we've seen a lot of businesses being really creative in that space and still seeing a lot of productivity flowing from that. But we recognise that in all of those circumstances, it may not be enough. Okay? We think that there are some great options and levers which businesses can utilise to avoid formal redundancies or closures. However, we recognise that sometimes is a requirement. So unlike a stand down where a business cannot trade, it's a stoppage of work due to circumstances beyond its control, a redundancy is where there is in effect a contraction of the business operations and a role is genuinely no longer required to be performed by anyone. In those circumstances, we can certainly undertake a redundancy, but there is a requirement to, first of all, A, undertake a consultation process with employees arising from an enterprise agreement or modern award, and we need to do that to minimise the exposure of an unfair dismissal claim. B, we need to consider options for redeployment across the business or any other associated entity. And again, we're needing to do that in a meaningful way to avoid the risk of an unfair dismissal claim. And if you get either of those aspects wrong, it's very difficult to defend an unfair dismissal claim. And lastly, there is an obligation for payment, and that is an obligation for wages up to and including the cessation date, notice or pay in lieu of notice, accumulated entitlements such as annual leave and long service leave, or of course the requirement to pay redundancy pay in certain circumstances. Now remember, under the Act specifies that redundancy pay is only payable where a business has 15 or more employees. So just remember that in those circumstances, if you are a small business, a very small business with 14 or less employees, you can make your permanent employees redundant and there isn't an obligation to pay redundancy pay. Consider this, however, because again, in these times, we recognise the termination costs when undertaking a redundancy process is of itself a financial burden upon many businesses at a time when revenue may be challenged in the current economic environment. But certainly, for those businesses where there's a constriction of trade or consumer demand and there's no other factor which is necessitating a stoppage of work, redundancies may be an option which you'll need to consider. So just before we move on from that, one thing which I'd like to explore just briefly, which isn't on the notes, is that whilst we're talking about formal procedures, the right to stand down and the right to undertake redundancies, the thing that we always need to remember that these are unprecedented circumstances which we're currently trading through. And with that, I think that there's perhaps never been a better opportunity for businesses to be creative and to have informed, transparent conversations with their employees concerning a temporary alteration to their working conditions and entitlements. Now, of course, we can't present it as a fait accompli. We can't threaten an employee to say that if they don't accept the variation, their employment will be terminated. However, if we have a meaningful discussion and consult with employees concerning the challenging economic environment in which we're trading and the difficult circumstances which the business is finding itself, and we state that one of the proposals which the company would like to explore is a temporary variation to an employee's terms and conditions of employment, I think most businesses in the current environment would get success. And we're seeing a lot of discussions involving things such as a temporary reduction in salary of 10, 15, 20%. We're seeing a reduction in working hours, whether it's full-time employee to a part-time role, a part-time employee reducing further their days and hours of work. Or it may even be an agreement that an employee take an extended period of unpaid leave. In all of the circumstances, I think that what we need to consider is the way in which it's positioned to employees will effectively result in the success of that process. And what I mean by that is we discuss with employees that we're only suggesting these options as a temporary solution, temporary. They'll be monitored. Their full-time entitlements or pre-pandemic entitlements will be reinstated at the first available opportunity. We also confirm that effectively, the steps taken by the company is taken in good faith to try to preserve as many roles as possible to avoid colleagues and individual team members being terminated. We also confirm that entitlements will be preserved at the full-time rate at the commencement of the temporary adjustment, and that in the event, the unforeseen circumstance, the undesirable circumstance, then the employee's employment is terminated, and it's not enough and the redundancy or termination needs to occur, that their entitlements upon termination will be paid out at their pre-pandemic rate. So we are seeing that whilst the formal stand-down and the formal redundancy procedures are certainly available to businesses, we would encourage businesses in this really challenging time to consider whether there are any other options available to you which would provide some form of required economic relief, still maintain people in employment, albeit at a reduced rate, for a temporary period until we come out back end of this. The difficult thing is, through those discussions, is how long will that temporary adjustment be? And of course, it's difficult to provide employees with any form of commitment, and I would strongly suggest that we don't, when we know that the Prime Minister is suggesting that there is going to be some economic adjustment or pain, as he describes it, over a period of at least 6 months. Many economic forecasters and commentators are predicting that the downturn and the implications and effect of that will be relatively deep and long. How long and how deep, we don't know, So, when we're discussing those temporary alterations to terms and conditions, let's just be cautious not to provide any commitment other than having ongoing transparent conversations with our team members around the ongoing impact to the business, the likely date upon which those entitlements can be reinstated, and any other factors which we should be aware of. Noting the time, and we spent quite a bit of time on the coronavirus issue, I would like to just quickly move on. Apologies, just having a look quickly at some of the questions which we've looked at. I believe all of which have been predominantly answered, and of course, if I've missed any questions, please feel free to ask them again towards the end of the presentation. One of the other questions which we're seeing frequently, noting the time, is just quickly in relation to WHS, stating whether the business is at risk. It's a really interesting question, and of course, a business has an obligation. Its primary obligation is to protect the welfare and well-being of its employees, and therefore all businesses are strongly encouraged to make themselves aware of government regulations concerning washing hands, facilities, etc. Hand wash, sanitisers, those type of things. We would also strongly suggest, as I mentioned before, that a WHS self-declaration be taken prior to working from home. It may be possible that an employer is held accountable where COVID-19 is transacted or infected in the workplace. However, it is an unknown and complicated area, given that it's going to be challenged and there's going to be needed to be proven that that's where the infection arose. But having said that, there is, leaving aside the issue around the validity of a workers' compensation claim, there is at its foremost and most fundamental issue a requirement to protect the welfare and well-being of your employee through positive, proactive steps. So just before we move on, a couple of take-home tips. Consider well-developed communication with your team. We would strongly suggest a COVID-19 policy. We would strongly suggest communication around personal health, hygiene, etc. We would certainly suggest that communication with your employees also touch upon their mental well-being, personal well-being at this particular time. We would strongly suggest that businesses explore the options of implementing an EAP program in the event that they haven't already done so. We also think that there is a best practice suggestion that we frequently check in with our people in these uncertain times to test their well-being, how they're travelling at home, how they're coping on working remotely in the absence of the office. In addition to that, obviously there are some most basic questions that we need to consider. That is the impact that COVID-19 is having on our business, the implications of that, whether we can't trade, whether there's a general downturn in business, whether that will result in redundancies, or whether we wish to keep employees employed and offer part-time arrangements. They're all things that need to be considered first before we go on. Okay? So moving on, and of course I'll answer and leave an opportunity. We are running a little bit over time, so I'll be very quick through the next two particular sections. Excuse me, and I'm more than happy to answer other questions on COVID-19 towards the end of the presentation if needed, but probably spending a couple of minutes only on each of these, and of course the recording will be provided to each of you after today's session together with the slides which we're going through. But the other things I want to talk about is recent amendments to number of awards, 22 modern awards, which from the 1st of March have annualised salary provisions included within them. Now, I'll go through the particular awards which are impacted in a moment. However, predominantly, I think for most of you who are attending today, having a quick look at those in attendance, Banking and Finance Award is one, Clerks Private Award is another, the Contract Call Centre is another, Manufacturing Award is another, and there's obviously other awards, but we'll go through them. In effect, this model clause has been introduced as a result of the modern award process and the overarching need to ensure that people paid a salary are paid a salary at least equivalent to the minimum rates and terms and conditions under the corresponding award. Obviously, everyone's aware of the large-scale underpayment cases which come out. In essence, what the model clauses, and there's 3 model clauses, we'll discuss model clause 1 and 3, state is that there needs to be an agreement between the employer and the employee concerning the annualised salary. Yeah? The model clause 1 does not require a written agreement. Yeah? Really important distinction. Model clause 1 doesn't require a written agreement, but it must be an agreement with the employee concerning what award provisions are incorporated within the salary. So that's overtime, allowances, those type of things. There also needs to be clear understanding around the outer parameters of that. And what we mean by that is the salary incorporates 3 overtime hours per week, as an example. The reason why we need to communicate the outer limit of ordinary hours is for the purposes of an employee understanding where they work outside that agreed and established framework, there's an expectation to receive additional payment in accordance with the overtime provisions under that award. The other important factor that arises from the annualised salary provisions is the requirement to maintain a very detailed record of the hours worked. From that, there needs to be a reconciliation taken every 12 months outlining and calculating whether the actual hours worked has resulted in an employee experiencing an underpay as compared to what they would have received had they been paid strictly in accordance with the award. And this is really important. If we look at a lot of the large underpayment announcements which have been made recently, Woolworths, Coles, etc., predominantly those underpayment claims have arisen from a salaried individual working excessive hours and therefore their salary being insufficient to meet the modern award conditions. So in that respect, this annualised salary provision creates clarity at the commencement of the arrangement, so employees are aware of the parameters in which they're operating. And then it goes a step further by saying that there is a requirement to maintain adequate records of start, finish times and breaks so that a reconciliation can be taken at the end of the 12-month period to determine if there's a shortfall. And if there is a shortfall, it must be paid within 14 days. So 2 things with that. One, we say that there needs to be an accurate record of hours worked, which must be signed or otherwise acknowledged by the employee in writing. Now, whilst there isn't a nominated system or process, we say that it has to be more than simply in business relying upon an employee's login times on the computer system, as an example, or the swipe card or entry card data which is received, because an employee may be working prior to entering the workplace, the premises, or likewise may be working prior to logging on to the computer system. So an adequate system needs to be in place which captures all of that data. The complexity for many businesses is, well, what's work? If I'm on a bus to work, undertaking emails on my iPad, does that constitute work? And technically it does. If I'm working at home of an evening or weekend, how do we capture that? Unfortunately, there's no bespoke or overarching answer I can provide other than saying a solution needs to be determined owing to the particular circumstances of the business and the way in which work is performed, which will enable you to capture that and an employee to record it. So all of the awards under the Model Clause 1, that's banking and finance, legal services, etc., there, the common ones are up on screen. Model Clause 3 is a little bit different. Same overarching principles that I've just discussed, however, with the fundamental difference that a written agreement is required. Yeah? The difference being there that we now say that upon the commencement of any employees under Model Clause 3 and the list of awards there, we must get that written agreement through. this all mean for us? We mean that, you know, the annualised salary provisions will absolutely apply. The full bench authority has indicated that the decision is not intended to invalidate or regulate common law contracts. So we take that to mean that there is nothing stopping the employer and the employee agreeing to overarching commercial frameworks or employment terms within a contract. We still need to go through that process. What it does say, however, is that there is a very strict obligation with regards to record keeping, and we need to be conscious of that because technically this is now a requirement of the modern award, and failure to comply with the provisions of the modern award may result in significant penalties of itself, so we need to be very conscious of that. And it also means that there is this audit requirement every 12 months, which means that businesses which have previously undertaken an approach of the set and forget type mentality with salaries will no longer be able to operate that model moving forward. We need to ensure that with salaries that they adequately reflect the terms and conditions that an employee would otherwise receive. Now, in that sense, the annualised audit, many of these businesses under the particular awards, banking and finance as an example, that's very rarely going to impact on those particular occupations and professions, given that in that industry we often find that salaries or market salaries significantly exceed that under the modern award. However, unlike that, there are other awards, Contract Call Centre Award, the Clerks Private Award as an example, where it's more common that those particular employees covered by those awards will be paid a salary closer to the minimum entitlements under that award, and therefore we really need to be clear and very conscious around setting modern salaries and reviewing it on a regular basis. The other thing which I just really wanted to quickly touch upon is that there may be an amendment, or there has been rather, a decision in the miscellaneous award, and then a final decision is due any day concerning the application of the miscellaneous award. Recently, on the 12th of February, was an initial review where the Fair Work Commission proposed an amendment which basically changed the coverage provisions which opened that particular award up to a greater cohort of employees which were traditionally and currently considered award-free. Some of the examples they used are childcare workers associated with a fitness establishment, as an example. We're still waiting on that final decision to come through, but it may be that we see, and we're anticipating this, that the coverage rules under the miscellaneous award will be broadened, which means that a great number of employees which are currently considered award-free will now come under the structure of that particular award. Yeah. Now, we're going to have to see the implications of that and what the final decisions are. However, that's certainly something which we need to consider. And I guess watch this space, because once that final decision has come down, we can certainly communicate the impact on our clients and members. I don't want to touch upon it briefly because we've run out of time, but there is obviously the ongoing process of the award review, the 2014 Modern Award Review. There are a number of very important decisions, some 6 years after it started, still awaiting finalisation, including the entitlement to overtime for casual employees in a large number of modern awards. All I can say is that with those particular issues, we will certainly communicate to our members and clients anything which is coming out of that award review process so that we can keep you fully informed. Yep. The other thing which I just wanted to very quickly touch upon, and again noting that we're out of time and wanting to touch upon it, is that effectively we are still within a very strict compliance framework, meaning that underpayments are still front and centre of our clients' businesses. So just be conscious of that. I know that a lot in terms of COVID-19 is overtaking our requirements, but we would still strongly encourage you to think of that strong compliance framework in which we're operating. And naturally, if any business has any concern around underpayments or suspected underpayments within their network, by all means, we're happy to answer any questions. So I appreciate, and I'm sorry that I've gone a little bit over time, which has probably cut into the Q&A time. I've tried where I can, though, to answer specific questions as we're going through. I believe that we've addressed many of them as I've gone through. However, if any of you feel as if I haven't addressed your specific question, please feel free to type in a question now. I'm more than happy to stay on the line a little bit and answer any particular questions that people may have. So I'll just wait for a little while to see if anyone has any particular questions. Thank you. One question which has come through, which is an unfortunate question, but one which is arising in the context of the current environment, is what would happen to employees if the company become insolvent? Look, I don't really want to dwell on this because it's a rather complex area, but in the event that the company becomes insolvent, there's a formal process of appointing an administrator or a liquidator to that particular process. Naturally, if a company winds up and can't pay their debts and there's an administrator or liquidation process, well then the employees can claim within 12 months upon termination their entitlements from the federal government. There's a guarantee of employee entitlement scheme that the government operates, which means that employees can claim against the government, and then the government will stand in the line of creditors through the liquidation and insolvency process. So in short, if the company winds up, employees' employment will typically terminate at the date of wind up, and then in the event that the company can't afford to pay because they're in liquidation, they can't pay, then basically they can claim their entitlements from the government through the employment guarantee scheme, and then the government will seek to reimburse. Also a question whether the copy of the slides will be available. Yes, they will. I understand that all persons will receive an email after this which contains a recording of this session together with the slides. Really good question around, other than COVID-19 and annualised salary, what are your thoughts on the other main concerns for HR this year? Very quickly, other concerns for HR probably are more around the compliance piece, which I've mentioned. I think that that's a massive piece. I haven't devoted enough time to it today. I appreciate that and I apologise that I can speak on an hour on that of itself. The significance of the underpayment issues which have been recently announced, Woolworths, Coles, etc., are significant. And there's been an increase in that focus by the Ombudsman, etc. So that is one area. Another, I think, which we really need to focus on as people leaders, employees' wellbeing. I certainly think this COVID-19 pandemic is warranting closer attention to that, and that's something we're going to have to consider as well. They're probably the two big areas I think that we're going to have to concentrate from an HR perspective, people's management and wellbeing, but also the issue around underpayments. So the rest of the questions I think have been predominantly answered. In relation to the COVID-19 policy, there have been a couple of questions in relation to a COVID-19 policy. Yes, we have prepared a COVID-19 policy and we're in the process of uploading that to our HRA cloud platform and enable HR for the use of our members, and confirmation will be sent through shortly once that's uploaded. So that being said, I appreciate again that I'm over time. I apologise for that. But thank you everyone again for your attendance today. It's greatly appreciated. If you do have any further questions arising around the topic or any other matter in general, please feel free to contact the HR Assured telephone advisory service for those HR Assured clients. My team would be only too happy to assist. And for Enable HR clients, obviously look at the documentation, workflows, and all of the alerts and notifications which we push through Enable HR. And I wish you all luck in managing the COVID-19 issue. And please let us know if we can be of any support. Thank you.